All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Today we have Curtis Yarvin with us. And Curtis is a monarchist, an absolute monarchist, not a costume monarchist. And he has been associated with the neo-reactionary movement. So that being said, Curtis, welcome to the Stoa.
Thank you. I seem to be able to unmute here. How's my audio? Is my audio good?
Yeah,
Everyone
that
can
is
hear
great.
me? Excellent, wonderful. I'm just going to pop something in my espresso machine right here, and there may be some noise, and I will be ready to begin. Thank you so much for having me on here.
Cool. Um, so a few people, when they found out that you were coming, they're like, "Wow, you got Curtis Yarvin," and some people were upset. So I was like, I did something naughty or something having you on. And so this might
Indeed.
set up the conversation on the cathedral, but I'm curious why do you think there's a sense of controversy surrounding you?
Gosh, why I think there's a sense of controversy surrounding me. I've never really been asked that question before. I think that people, let me take a moment to answer this. I think people overrate in many ways their relevance and importance, and in of specifically their political participation in the world. I think that most people feel a sort of great sense of importance from kind of mattering in a sense, even though I would assert that that sense is mostly sort of has a kind of pornographic quality in terms of their participation in the political world. I think very few people matter at all, and not much in the way that we think. And so when you give people the idea that either the way in which they matter could be or should be taken away, or that they don't matter that much, or that the things they believe are actually harmful in some sense, they tend to react as if you'd stolen their puppy. And I don't steal anyone's puppy. I'm not a puppy stealer, but I understand that reaction, and I sort of feel a little bit sad about it, I guess. But you know what? The dog's bark and the caravan moves on. I don't know.
And so the cathedral concept, I think you wrote about it in 2008 in your
Something like that. Yes.
and in your recent piece in Gray Mirror, you described it as basically journalism plus academia, all
Yeah.
the intellectual institutions at the center, at the heart of modern society, sort of like how the church was, but now it leans progressive and woke.
And it's decentralized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's like the mystery. Like a lot of people are seduced by a conspiratorial narrative, but like, how do all these prestigious institutions, even though they have no central organizing authority, how are they having the same talking point and acting as if they are? Um, and so, for people who
Right.
are just being onboarded to this, anything else you think would be good to add to that?
No, I think that's really the central mystery. The central mystery is why we have all of these people sort of trust these institutions because of their polycentric nature, and yet you don't see them drifting apart from each other in any sense. You see them drifting only closer and closer together. So Harvard does not move right while Yale moves left. The Washington Post does not move right while the New York Times moves left. They're all drifting over time. They're all drifting in the same direction, and they're all just drifting sort of closer and closer to us, to each other. It's sort of like, people assumed when they first kind of got really powerful telescopes and looked at astronomy that all the galaxies were just kind of moving around randomly, and then they realized, whoa, they're actually like all moving away from us. And this, sort of the explanation of this kind of surprising order led to the theory of the Big Bang. And so the theory of basically why this marketplace of ideas tends to basically converge to such a point that the sort of they converge into a little bubble which is constantly shrinking, and perspectives far from sort of new perspectives being discovered, perspectives which were formerly acceptable tend to disappear from the bubble until it sort of converges into this tiny sort of point of light. And some of these theories, some of the ways of thinking within the bubble are very they're very like, they would seem very strange to a person coming from 50 years ago. Of course, we would say that that person, or people within the bubble would say that that person had sort of yet to learn a certain amount of information. And so, one possibility that has to be considered is that these are all converging for the same reason that we're all converging on the fact that water is H2O, or that, sort of converging in the sense that science converges. And that's clearly the metaphor that the whole of academia wants us to operate on, but it doesn't seem like the sort of the consensus is this strong. And so the question is basically, if there are things that are driving that consensus that is not driving it toward the truth, what are the forces and factors involved, and why is this happening? Fair enough.
Yeah. And a lot's happened since 2008, like Trump, COVID, Ukraine, a bunch of current things. Anything that surprised you that made you like modify this model of the cathedral?
No. I mean, there were sort of interesting, there were very, COVID especially had some very interesting sort of twists and turns, which kind of let you see some of these forces at work. You might remember the flip in early 2020, where in like February of 2020, we were all supposed to go ahead and lick doorknobs and not care about the coronavirus. And then Donald Trump decided that he also did not care about the coronavirus, which resulted in a sort of complete flipperoo. I think that if Trump had just had gone sort of full COVID hardliner and been like, we have to preserve our precious bodily fluids, from this evil Chinese disease, and then we would still be being asked to lick doorknobs. And so what you see is that the forces acting, like sort of anything like that, sort of gets you a picture of the forces that are driving the consensus in one direction or another. And those forces don't necessarily, we have this abstract model of like, we understand when we look at this system that prestigious ideas govern the world essentially, and the world has to be governed according to prestigious ideas and non-prestigious ideas. And if we imagine those prestigious ideas to be generated by a marketplace of ideas which selects entirely for good ideas, then it's very simple to explain this behavior, which is that we found the best ideas, and ideas keep getting better and keep getting righter, and we keep converging on a truer and truer truth. And the sense that, at a certain point, you either have to really, really believe that, and to really, really believe that, you have to really ignore some like really strange stuff that's going on. But sorry, Mike, the car dealer is calling me. But to to accept that, you have to believe some really, really hard to believe stuff. But the idea that basically this marketplace of ideas is not optimizing for truth, justice, beauty, whatever, is sort of like, well, what would that even mean? Because I mean, these people are very, very smart. They're generally smart and well-intentioned. How are they, if they are systematically wrong in this way, what is causing that, and how does that phenomenon work? And the thing is that basically I try to explain that, I think it's very important to explain that phenomenon in a way that sort of drives people away either from the illusion of kind of centralized, I mean, there are networks that are sort of a little bit centralized-ish, but they sort of don't really modify the fundamental conclusion. You want to push the sort of the thinking of this away from something like a centralized network. You want to push it away from the kind of military thinking that sort of assumes like the collective malice of the enemy. And the like and sort of just analyze this system, not to sort of fight it really, but just to understand how it works. It has like certain flaws like every other way of getting along that's ever been devised. And let's understand this and sort of see what the fundamental flaws in the model are, and then determine how it can be fixed.
So yeah, anyone feel free to put your question in the chat. I'll ask Curtis one more question. And you can ask them whatever you want, really. It doesn't have to be on the topic of Cathedral. And the last question is, it might sound like a little bit of a circling, authentic relating question. I know you're dunking on that in your blog post,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm curious how the cathedral sees you, or how you think the cathedral sees you, or like academics or journalists studying your work have seen you. Where have you like felt seen by that? Where did you feel like they missed the mark?
Well, I can't really answer very much because I really don't like looking at responses. Like a lot of writers, I really don't like looking at responses to my own work. There was a piece in Tablet on me recently. I'm told it's fairly good. I haven't read it. There was a piece by me in Tablet, accompanying it, which I also don't read my own work after I read it, so I haven't read this either. Right. So I tend to be a write and forget kind of guy. That's just a literary dysfunction, really. But yeah, I would say that, like, when you see, I mean, there's a sort of number of ways of considering the problem. Generally, what people do when they're inside a bubble and that bubble is the whole world to them is that they sort of pick a point outside the bubble, and that point outside the bubble becomes kind of a metonym for the world outside that bubble. So one of the ways I like to explain this often is the use of the word Gentile. So if you're familiar with the word Gentile, which means something actually different in Utah, which is great. I can go to Utah and be a Jewish Gentile. Gentile is a word that describes a negative set. So basically, a Gentile could be a Buddhist. He could be a Zoroastrian. He could be a Muslim. He could be, anything that's not a Mormon or anything that's not a Jew. If you're in Israel, he could be a Hindu, right? And so the problem comes when you take a negative, it's a perfectly legitimate category in a sense, but when you take a negative category and you try to describe its characteristics, and so you say Gentiles are like this, based on looking like at a Hindu or something. And then you're just like, no, they're actually more like that. You just sort of get nonsense. You can't actually categorize the features of a negative set, except as sort of negative features. A Gentile is someone who doesn't believe in Mormonism. Right. And so actually people who don't believe in Mormonism believe in all kinds of different things. So when this is applied to the political system of the bubble, people sort of think in terms of a spectrum from left to right, but that spectrum is actually sort of coiled up. That is actually, for me, a spectrum of inside the bubble to outside the bubble. So as you go toward the right, the problem is that the variety of perspectives that you see increases and increases. And so you're basically like, everything outside this bubble is Hitler. You're not saying everything outside this bubble is Louis XIV, or everything outside this bubble is, the Venetian Republic, or everything outside this bubble is Bismarck's Prussia, or 1,000 other different examples. You're basically, and this is what it means to think in an essentially provincial way. When you're thinking in the bubble, one of the things you do is you ascribe wildly outsized importance to historical examples from the last 50 to 100 years. So you're looking at history itself through a fisheye lens. 12 years in Germany is more important than the whole 17th century. And so you're sort of, you kind of, even the things outside the bubble you see are in some ways distorted reflections of the bubble itself. I mean, Hitler, for example, is kind of a distorted reflection of liberalism in many ways. He's sort of kind of he's kind of antithetical to liberalism in the way that, say, Louis XIV or Elizabeth I is not. And so, even in the enemies of this system in the 20th century, you get this cramped smallness that sort of takes place around the edge of the bubble. And those examples tend to be bad ones. And so when you try to basically fit kind of thinking that is more broadly historical than this kind of 20th century bubble in this 20th century conflict, you're it's hard to fit it into your mind because you're convinced that the bubble is the whole world.
Right. All right. So let's pivot to Q&A. We got a bunch of questions in the chat. We'll go in order. And one follow-up question only. So
Sure.
Kaleem, you're up first. Or Kalim. If you can just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey, Curtis, how are you doing?
Good.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah. So
Yep.
my question is whether you think in your, writing and politics and engagement, you've been successfully consistent with your pacifist political strategy, and if so, then wouldn't, according to sort of your theory, you not be viewed as much as a threat by the cathedral as you apparently are?
I've been only partially and intermittently successful. I think that many people who have been inspired by me have been much more successful. It's kind of impossible to avoid that role to some extent. And when you read my old blog posts, I slip more easily into a kind of joyously confrontational state of mind than I do now. So it's sort of it's a mixed bag in some ways, and I certainly, like, I don't advise people who read my stuff to come out of the closet. I don't advise them to like combine their sort of online and offline identities. I don't advise them to do a lot of different things that I did. And but yeah, that's I'm who I am, I'm where I am, it's fine. I don't know.
So from your perspective, like the theory is sound, but the implementation was lacking for
Well,
particular
I
reasons.
developed the theory as as I saw myself implementing it. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, of course, there's a lot of things I'd do differently if I were doing this whole thing, again, but I'm not doing it again. So there.
Thank you.
Radio, you had a question. We can't hear you.
We've got radio silence.
Yeah, it looks like he's frozen now.
Terrible.
Okay, we'll pivot to Kazanjian. Daniel Kazanjian, you had a question.
Yeah, Curtis, I once heard you say that based on historical records, there's evidence that the Roman elite still thought the empire was alive and well, like well after modern historians now believe it had already fallen.
Well, it depends what you mean by like the empire, right? I mean, of course, the Byzantine. Do you mean the Republic or the empire? Is, I guess, my question. The Roman Empire always called itself the Respublica, from like until like as long as the Roman Senate was convening, which I think was well into the 600 ADs. This word was used. Of course, the Byzantine Empire always called themselves Rome as well, even as they started speaking Greek. And so, the sense of like the Roman Empire is sort of like the sense of the Republic falling was sort of, I think it was an abstraction that most aristocrats sort of understood at the time. They clearly understood that Augustus was something different and that it resembled, in practice, a Hellenistic monarchy, but that was just not part of their sort of official sort of understanding of the situation. And so basically, a lot of the history of the early empire especially is, after Augustus, it sort of can get a little controversial because we don't really know whether, say, Nero was that much of a bad guy. We only know that the aristocrats who wrote the histories fucking hated him. But then, of course, kind of they would. But, he probably was a putz, but it's really hard to know these things. There was certainly this feeling that, persisted for a long time that the sort of, fall of the Republican system was bad in some ways. At the same time, it clearly worked a lot better. So, yeah, I mean, my favorite example of this phenomenon is the Emperor of Japan, who I think last really was sort of a working emperor about a millennium ago. But that whole system has basically persisted. And so you get systems like what you see in Japan, where one monarchy becomes a symbolic monarchy and another monarchy becomes a real monarchy under it. So the Tokugawas, for example, were like the shoguns were, in practice monarchs, but they were technically the emperor's military leader. Or everyone knows the case of the mayors of the palace and the Merovingian kings in the time leading up to Charlemagne. And so, yeah, that's a very, it's very, very common for sort of forms to disappear and be maintained in sort of symbolic form.
Well, I guess all of that made me wonder where we are with regards to the West and how you would conceptualize the Western Empire, or specifically just the US, and has it already fallen? If it did, when did it fall?
Well, fallen, I mean, I would say that if you look at the American system of government, what you see is the kind of the genius of it is that it kind of has sort of all three forms in the Constitution. And so what you see is sort of more of an oscillating pattern where, excluding the Articles of Confederation period, you have this sort of kind of have a de facto monarchy about 75 or every 75 or 80 years. And so you have the original government is basically set up under the auspices of Washington by Alexander Hamilton, who's kind of a startup guy. That kind of, sort of falls apart leading up to the Civil War. And then that structure is renewed by Lincoln. That structure becomes, oligarchical in a very different sense. It becomes kind of a plutocracy. And then that plutocracy is more or less overthrown by FDR, who again becomes another monarch. And so, and FDR is really in control of the government. And so if you compare FDR's like personal authority to the personal authority of Biden or Obama or Trump, all of which are sort of different in different ways, you're seeing several orders of magnitude in difference. It's not quite the difference between Elizabeth I and Elizabeth II, which is kind of my benchmark, but it approaches that in some ways. And so you definitely can say that sort of, in the sense that democracy implies that the people have a will and that will controls the government, and they express that will by electing politicians who control the government. Yes, there's no democracy is not really a thing. And, one sort of artificial thought experiment that I usually use to describe this is I say, well, if you're looking at a symbolic organ of government, you should be able to remove that organ and have the country go on as normal. You could remove the English monarchy, and the only people who would be seriously offended would be like tabloid readers, right? You could remove, but you couldn't remove Elizabeth I the same way. I don't know what would happen to Elizabeth in England if you remove Elizabeth I, but it's not Elizabeth in England. I don't know what happens to Napoleonic France if you remove Napoleon, but it's not Napoleonic France. And so, you can detect the sort of realness of the organ that way. So if you look at basically our system of government, all you have to do is recognize that the executive branch can function perfectly well without the White House. In fact, I think the White House can function perfectly well without the president. And, I think most people would agree that the executive branch would actually in many ways function better without the White House. It's just a distraction because you're not really looking at the executive branch, you're looking at the legislative branch. Then you go over to the Congress and you say, well, this is a very, very democratic organ. As you may know, the House of Representatives was intended to be the home of turbulent, democracy. Thanks to an incumbency system and a seniority system combined, you have this amazingly gerontocratic system where, Dianne Feinstein doesn't even recognize other senators, and she's still in. I mean, the Soviets would never go that far, right? And so you have this. The legislative branch is this sort of amazing buffer against democracy, which manages to pull off the difficult feat of being absolutely democratic in practice and yet not being democratic at all, because you can only rarely elect a new senator and then they're at the bottom of the heap. And so you have this, and that's the sort of the buffer that stands in front of the executive branch. Here's an experiment. Go to anyone who works in DC on the Hill or whatever and tell them we don't have an executive branch, we have a legislative branch, and they'll agree with you. It works every time, right? And so basically this is the sort of fundamental bulwark of oligarchy against democracy that basically manages to kind of keep the peasants with their pitchforks at bay. And Nixon couldn't crack it, Reagan couldn't crack it, Trump couldn't crack it. Right. They couldn't even scratch it. They sort of got elected, Trump got elected and sort of assumed he was the leader of the free world. And, just like he was so clueless that he couldn't even tell that he wasn't actually in power for years. Nixon had this thing of, where he's like, okay, I'm going to take charge of this system and make it work well, rather than like the whole like emphasis of the people who are like Nixon, Reagan holdovers in the Trump administration, like Barr and Bolton, had this very Nixonian attitude that we're the adults in the room and we're going to show you how to run this government in an adult way. And they got nowhere. They did nothing. And so all those people have to go. It's too bad because they sort of know these institutions and they know where the bodies are buried, but they don't want to destroy the institutions. They want to take them over and make them work properly as they conceive it. And so there's sort of no, like, until you have a presidency in which basically the will of the voters and the will of the candidate is really to break this system with just sort of the maximum theoretical energy described in the Constitution. I mean, this is ridiculous. It's unconstitutional. In the Constitution, it says that the president is the chief executive of the executive branch. These are ordinary English words, which should mean what they say. Right. And so until you sort of break that, and then sort of even how you break it is open to question, because this thing is so enormous, you really don't have any substantive political change at all, nor can you see the possibility of it. This is why you basically get this pattern under the American Constitution of a monarchy, decaying into an oligarchy, and then something snaps and you have your monarchy back again. Cool. So that's what's coming next, but I don't know when it's coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Evan, you had a question.
Yeah, so in your writing, at least on unqualified reservations, you often talk about how you get these sort of bastard hybrids of left and right. You use Hitler as an example here, a few others. So I'm curious how you see the state of the modern right with respect to is this all just the sort of bastard hybrid of the left and right that you talk about, giving the example of Hitler in your writing, or basically how do you see the current state of play there?
I would say that the sort of the intellectual level of the right has certainly advanced since I was writing these kinds of things 10 or 15 years ago. And so there are definitely there's definitely some set of people who I would say have a better understanding of what's going on. I don't know that there's really anyone who shares my understanding of the solution, which is fine. The sense of, I tend to use like kind of slightly different terminology these days because I try to sort of not reinforce that kind of polarity as much. I guess what I would say is that there's a sort of a mix of, in the American right, there's a lot of different tropes which are sort of very performative. I mean, the right sort of suffers from this sort of problem of having been, some people would say controlled opposition. There's a sense in which kind of the original sin of the post-war American order is the selection of Wendell Willkie as the Republican nominee in 1940, because Wendell Willkie had been a Democrat up till 6 months before the election and agreed with FDR on the main question of the election, which was whether to fight a war in Europe. And if you were looking at a random third world country in which this happened, you would basically say, okay, this is no longer a two-party state in any real sense. And so essentially the absence of anything quite like existential opposition has left the Republicans in this sort of place where they look around for, you know, I think many people, when they voted for Eisenhower, thought, oh, we've elected a Republican. He's going to roll back the New Deal. He's going to roll us back to the Hoover administration. In fact, Eisenhower had been talked about as a Democratic candidate in 1948. And so you sort of keep getting jobbed in this way. And it's sort of hard to go back and be like, wow, this was all really kind of fake. What do I revise when I'm sort of looking at this fakeness? And so you have this kind of lost feeling where you're sort of like kind of running around on this kind of kayfabe stage looking for things that will excite people. And essentially your politics runs mostly on the basis of exciting the boomers, essentially, or exciting the boomer is a slur. I should say person of boom, but you're trying to basically stimulate emotional energy, and you're sort of a dog chasing a car, and it's like either you know or you don't know that you can't catch the car, or if you can catch the car, you'll just get your teeth locked in it and just get dragged. And so it has a very it sort of has a very purposelessness sense, and it sort of consists of people putting one foot in front of the other without really having a plan or knowing what they're trying to do. And so in that circumstance, a lot of these plans or ideas will be like bad ideas, but the problem isn't really with the ideas. The problem is like in not having a telos.
So quick follow-up on that. That's interesting. I wonder, so you say not having a telos. This seems to be a feature of all noteworthy political movements in the United States, as far as I can tell at this point, or at least not having a positive telos. What I mean by this is political movements currently in the United States, and as far as I can tell, a lot of the Western world at this point seem to primarily define themselves in terms of what they're in opposition to. And so, like in your work, you talk a lot about, sorry, just real quick to follow up, you talk a lot about the importance of a stack where you basically have law and then freedom at the top of the stack. And it seems like both sides are in fundamental opposition to some aspects of at least law. So wondering about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the American, I mean, we don't, like, I don't know if you've ever been in a lawsuit, but we're in like the American legal system is a shambles, really. And the sense of like, it's kind of funny because the American regime was in many ways founded by a bunch of law nerds, and sort of law nerding was a sort of very traditional Puritan kind of perspective. In a sense, the English Civil War was basically sort of Charles I getting law nerded out of his job, or letting himself get law nerded out of his job before he he realized that he was getting law nerded out of his job. I think he realized that he was getting law nerded out of his job around the time that they the Parliament managed to execute his chief advisor, but Strafford. But and he's like, wait a second, should I have done that? And so first of all, there's something meretricious about the American tradition of law nerding. Secondly, we're really no longer a country in which people feel the majesty of law to any significant extent. And so I would say that before sort of there can be kind of any return to these principles, like you can't really have law like in the context of a hot war. Like if I'm in a shooting war, I see someone whose helmet is the wrong shape, I'm going to shoot them. I'm not going to have a trial before I shoot them. Right. And so even in like a sort of cold Civil War situation like we're in now, the rule of law really breaks down considerably, and it breaks down in just all sorts of ways. And so really the only question, as Lewis Carroll put it, the only question in the current political debate or cold Civil War is who is to be master, right? And the thing is, naturally, the people who are sort of presently masters will have the like they'll sort of end up with almost a kind of small c conservative perspective, because they don't have quite have visions of creating something different. I mean, there were a lot of crazy visions around in like FDR's day, but it's sort of settled down into a kind of status quo. And then the people who want to change, who are the masters, will have very inchoate, general, vague visions, which often are sort of not. I mean, the main problem with these visions is they sort of simply don't have the magnitude to overthrow a system of this type. And they don't have a dream. It's like when people talk about like critical race theory in the public schools, it's like you're talking about it and like, no, I don't want this. Well, what do you want? Right. And the question of what do you want, and like how would a public school be organized if, let's say, Ron DeSantis were organizing the public school? Would it be exactly the same textbooks except with like no critical race theory? I can't really quite believe that. Right. And so basically the sort of the smallness of either he's hiding some bigger vision or he has no bigger vision. Either of those things is cringe and sort of does not basically display readiness for power or a feeling of worthiness of power. And as they say, the public is a woman, and if you don't feel confident and worthy and you try to ask the public or a woman for their support or affection, they're going to laugh at you. And because confidence is like the self-confidence can be faked, but it's such a strong and necessary feature. And so the sense that like the right is not in any sense ready for power is obviously very strong among the left, but I think it should be much stronger among the right as well. Sorry if that was too long.
Awesome. Thanks, Evan. Radio, do you want to give another try with your question?
All right. Can you guys hear me right now?
Yep.
Amazing. All right. Well, thanks a lot for coming on, Curtis. I've been very influenced by a lot of your thinkings and critiques of these things. And so my question is about your general critique of freedom. I've got it written out here. So basically, because of the fact that as a society, we're very fresh in our particular veneration of this as a virtue, I think it's worth looking into a little deeper. Basically, what it seems like you say is the modern vision of freedom produces it incentivizes parasitism on the psychological mechanisms of choice that we have. Therefore, we become less free because of the cathedral oligarchy rather than more. With economic freedom, you get addiction and advertisement, and your focus on democratic freedom means maximalism of manufacturing consent and stimulating agency for people. And I think these are all really great critiques. The issue I wonder, though, is that these are issues where a naive pursuit of freedom causes a meta form of unfreedom to emerge on top of that substrate. And because we're so new to this, I wonder, I put the question to you, because you like G and you like monarchy and so on, is what if rather than saying that the desire for freedom is naive, we say instead that we should take it much more seriously and say something like true freedom is freedom from psyops and a freedom from our own immaturity.
Well, the thing is that, the word freedom tends to be a very loaded word. People, pile a lot of different things on the word freedom. Hobbes was writing about this, almost 400 years ago, 350 years ago, and was talking about how when people talk about freedom, they're not talking about, quote, I think the desolate freedom of the wild ass was his term. They're not talking about, basically, they wind up very easily going from talking about freedom to meaning power when they mean freedom, because in fact historically those things too often tend to go together. If you have sort of the freedom is a very sort of aristocratic desire and an aristocratic feeling. And so it's sort of important to kind of define the meaning of like freedom a little more clearly in this sense. One of the things that you see in the Western tradition that I don't really believe in is the concept of limited government, which to me sort of makes no sense, because that limit is always being imposed by something that is itself part of the government. And you might say that sovereignty is conserved in a second. If you have the First Amendment gives you the right to do X, the First Amendment must still be enforced by the Supreme Court. If they decline to enforce that, you don't get to do X. Sorry. And so the sense of, a better term, perhaps, which is less loaded, might be autonomy. And so you might think in terms of how much autonomy do people have in this system, how much, and that sort of, and that sort of, brings you to the question of how much autonomy do they actually deserve. A 3-year-old is a human being, is a person, does not really deserve autonomy. Autonomy is not good for this person. They need to exist in a very, very non-autonomous sense, if you've ever known a 3-year-old. At the same time, the 3-year-old has a very intense desire for autonomy. And so when you find yourself in the position of governing a 3-year-old, you basically experience this conflict sort of very, very clearly, because what you find is that the more you sort of give in to this desire for autonomy in an irresponsible way, the worse that relationship becomes. And so there are, the sort of one of the fundamental principles or maxims of law that dates back to the Byzantines or the Romans in some sense is to each his own, sum cuique. And so essentially, I basically do think that there are a lot of people in society who live in a basically aristocratic way, who sort of require a very large amount of aristocratic freedom. There are other people, like, we've sort of come up with this very binary definition of the amount of autonomy that a person deserves, which ends at age 18 and works the same for everyone, excluding certain disabled individuals and so forth. And it's clear that the appropriate, it's clear that a bright line like that cannot possibly be, it can only be an approximation of sort of the human reality. So for example, when I go to San Francisco and I see people living in tents on the street, my reaction is that these are essentially adult children who need to be taken care of. The problem in their lives is their autonomy. They're actually dying from autonomy, quite literally. And so, the sense of coming up with, the sort of libertarian idea of kind of deriving the right amount of the right system of autonomy for everyone from first principles seems to me to be a very quixotic and frankly very American kind of way of thinking about political science, which basically doesn't really jibe with the way most people have thought about this problem across history. Make sense?
Yeah. I guess I like that. I'd like to follow it up by saying I feel like in the gray mirror and the work that you do with the clear pill or whatever is an attempt in some way to fundamentally instigate people to become more mature with respect to their very deeply unfree reactive political sentiments or illusory beliefs in their own excessive agency in the system. And that produces maturation for people because they get a mental freedom from a psychic pressure that's being put on them externally. So
yes,
I feel like
that's a very real sense of the word freedom that I definitely would endorse.
Yes. So I see that in your writing, you seem to believe aspirationally in that process of helping people to mature to the point where the autonomy can be more afforded to them. So I guess I just would wonder.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I guess I would just wonder where you really land on this. Like if you go very deep into your what you want the most is what about this question of, and for you, the clear pill, this stuff, you only became quote unquote red pilled or whatever at some point in your life due to seeing things happening politically. Even you had to experience this awakening maturation moment. So maybe as a society, we could be at an early stage. And do you see aspirationally, maybe there's great heights of potential autonomy or worthiness of autonomy that could be reached that have not yet been reached?
Absolutely. And there's a sort of specific kind of autonomy that we're talking about here, which is absolutely really, I think, the right thing for kind of everyone who's capable of thinking for themselves, which unfortunately is not a very large percentage of humanity. But the thing is that the kind of autonomy that we're talking about here is the sense of not kind of being trapped in this kind of sports fan view of politics, where you're basically like, you're sort of, you know, you want to go to be sort of clear pilled, is to go from being a kind of emotional participant in what's happening on stage to sort of realizing that it's the stage and kind of detaching yourself emotionally from that. And the trick is that actually a lot of people sort of look at this attitude and are like, oh, that means you've sort of given up on sort of fighting to win. And it's like, no, actually, it is you who, by sort of participating in the action on the stage, has given up in fighting to win. And once you detach yourself from the stage, you can imagine yourself walking out of the building. You can imagine the whole building burning down. You can imagine, you basically, you know, see yourself living in a larger historical reality. And so this is something that actually modern people are sort of very good at doing, because they have a very strong sense of irony. And so basically engaging in sort of turning off that sense, that kind of animal sense, which wants to engage sort of in politics at a chimpanzee level. There's a lot of this great discourse actually in Dune, where, you know, he's like, much is made of the difference between a human being and an animal. And if you remember the scene with the Gom Jabbar, for example, and sort of in order to develop that kind of maturity and to kind of turn off your kind of animal instincts, once you do that, you see that there's a sort of huge range of potential actions that are sort of outside the domain of instinctive animal politics. And many of those ways of acting, if you can get a large enough collective to act in that way, are much more effective than the visceral instinctive animal ways of acting. And I like the King Crimson cover on the wall behind you, by the way. Did that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks a lot.
Cool.
This may be the last question. Kevin, you'd like to ask your question?
Yes. Hello, Mr. Yarvin. I have a question.
Hey.
Maybe it's a monarchy 101 kind of question.
Sure.
I'm wondering, like, so the example you use when I've heard you speak is like the example of like a corporation. But when I think of a corporation, they have CEOs and they have like COOs and
Right.
CFOs and boards of directors. Like, what makes you call yourself like a monarchist? Like, what's the importance of having like a single king or a single monarch? Like, is it?
Well, I mean, a CEO and a king are the same thing, right? The king is the CEO of the state. I think actually, Nayib Bukele of El Salvador, like, was switching his Twitter, description between president of El Salvador, dictator of El Salvador, CEO of El Salvador. And, the only sort of difference in these organizational structures is that a monarchy is sort of a first level structure. There's nothing sort of enforcing. It has to enforce itself, whereas the bylaws of a corporation and the fact that the CEO is in charge of the corporate assets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the board chooses the CEO, all of these are enforced by a higher level of sovereignty. And so if you're trying to sort of mimic something like that in the sense of like the private, if you're trying to sort of mimic one of these private sector type designs where this order is enforced by a higher level sovereignty, and you're trying to make it like actually sovereign, then you're doing something, you have to modify that design somewhat. If you go to I should pimp my graymirror.substack.com, you'll see one of the posts toward the top is called something like optimal autonomous organizations, where I kind of describe this this model both in the sense of a sovereign monarchy and in the sense of a DAO, that as they do on Web3, as it's called. So it's actually, it's like, to me, it's not that different. It's somewhat different, but it's not that different. And the sense in which basically, if you imagine, I mean, here in Silicon Valley, we do a lot of sort of two in the box CEOs. We have a lot of co-founder situations. And so I was a CEO, and then I was like, no, I don't want to be CEO, I want to be CTO. And I basically ran a company with my co-founder for about 5 years, and which is very like a marriage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I can imagine doing that with one person. I can imagine doing it with two people. I can maybe imagine it doing it with three. Three means you can take a vote, which is cool, the old triumvirate style. If you imagine trying to run a company in any kind of oligarchic or democratic fashion, you know, it's like the example I came up with is, imagine the Chipotle shareholders had to take a vote every time Chipotle wanted to introduce a new burrito flavor, right? And this is the way basically most DAOs in the glorious new world of Web3 work. And it's a shit show. And you would expect it to be a shit show. It's obviously a shit show. And the sort of this is like, you know, because it's sort of new, like Web3 and stuff, it's a sort of new area of endeavor. There aren't really Web3 organizations that are trying to compete with Chipotle. But Chipotle, because it has a monarch, would kick their ass. And so you're basically seeing that sort of everything that works in the modern world, if you drive a car, it was made by a monarchy. Go to a restaurant, the restaurant is run as a monarchy. You know, go to a movie, the movie is directed by a director who's a monarch, you know. And so you basically see that just in sort of a process manner, organizations that work tend to follow this very simple pyramid structure of like top-down delegated authority. And we would expect that to be the case in nations. That is in fact the case in nations. This is why basically 95, I don't know the actual number, the enormous you know, the enormous preponderance of sovereign regimes historically have been monarchies. And so you're basically just like, is our system of government one that works so well and is like so comfortable to live under and so effective and so efficient that basically we think we've found some exception to this pattern? And I just look at the way things work and I'm just like, no, actually, if you look at the difference between the USPS and UPS, UPS is a monarchy and the Postal Service is not a monarchy, right? You know, and so this is just a very simple organizational principle. And then your challenge is to make that monarchy sort of work as well. And, you know, the term I like to use is accountable monarchy, which is essentially what the CEO system does. And the question of how you build an accountable monarchy in the at a sovereign level is an interesting question that hasn't entirely been solved yet. If you look at that OAO post, that's sort of my attempt at the best possible solution. Like it's just, I absolutely hate like relying on modern technology in any way, shape, or form, but actually the blockchain does kind of help with this, I think. And so there are some things that are new under the sun, but monarchy is definitely not new under the sun. Fair answer.
Yeah, thank you. I'll read the post.
Thanks. Peter, you want to, are we at our hour here?
Yeah, we're closing to the top. So before we close, Curtis, any parting words you'd like to leave us with? And I'm also curious what modern writers or philosophers that have caught your attention.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I'm a big Welbeck fan, of course. You know, I like Nicholson Baker is amazing. I think everyone should read Nicholson Baker's Human Smoke, because that's sort of the best kind of emotional treatment of World War II, which is the war that kind of shaped the world that we live in. As a political primer, I always recommend, of course, James Burnham's The Machiavellians. That's a necessity. But if you're looking for current writers, I mean, there's a sort of new, like there's a whole sort of new generation of like publishing kind of opening up, where you basically see all these little publishers like, you know, Mystery Grove and Antelope Hill, and there's like 5 others or something. And so, you know, you have writers, you know, that exist entirely within that frame, that do fiction, you know, like Delicious Tacos or someone like that. So there's a whole sort of sphere opening up, and that sphere seems to be doing the thing that sort of new artistic spheres do, where they kind of don't really join the mainstream. They're kind of separate from it, and they sort of grow outside it, and sort of the way that punk was for a while. So the whole scene feels kind of very punk at the moment, and that's a very pleasant feeling, I think. But yeah, I could come up with a longer list, but if you read those, you'll do well.
Awesome. So we'll close here. And yeah, Curtis, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.